My name is Professor Michael Walls. I'm based at the Development Planning Unit at University College London. We're one of the member institutions of the London International Development Centre, along with a number of other universities in the area, including the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, the Royal Veterinary College, so as the Institute of Education at UCL, and a number of associate members. Shireen, can you hear me? I'm doing my best to introduce LIDC. Okay. Well, do you want to? I just said that LIDC is a membership organization and DPU is one of the members, and I listed some members. So maybe if you want to take over from me on that.
Thank you. Actually, it looks like this laptop, which is normally the one that doesn't work, is going to save the day. Thank you, everybody, for your patience. We do live in the real world, so mishaps do happen. I'm really sorry for the inconvenience, and thank you for your patience. As Professor Wall was just explaining, I've heard him speak before, so I know he explains everything graciously. LIDC is a membership organisation. We have 9 higher education institutions as members and a number of NGOs as members as well. If you are interested in joining us, please just go to our website and fill in the link on the homepage. Today's event is a welcome opportunity for us to investigate an issue that's very much in the headlines for good reason. I'm particularly fortunate that I have a job that allows me to be able to contact people who know about these things so that they can teach me, and by extension, all of you, about issues like climate change, sustainability, urban planning. And it's such a privilege to host Professor Clovis Ultramari today. I shall not take up too much of your time because I realize you've come here to hear from him rather than me, Freudian slip there. I shall shortly hand over to Professor Michael Walls. In the meantime, all that remains for me to do is to say, if you want to live tweet, then go ahead. If you have any questions, do please pop them in the Q&A and or the chat. We will be keeping an eye on those. So thank you so much again for your patience. Apologies for my internet troubles. I must have upset the ancestors today. And with no further ado, I'm going to stop my video and hand over to Professor Michael Walls. Thank you.
Thanks, Shireen. As I expected, Shireen did a far better job of introducing LIDC than I would have. So thanks for rescuing me from my ad hoc attempt at doing the same. So as I've already said, my name's Michael Walls. I'm at DPU at UCL, but it's not really about me now. I want to extend the warmest welcome to Professor Clovis Ultramari. Clovis is an architect and urban planner. For the past 25 years, he's been a professor at the Pontifical Catholic University of Parana in Brazil. He has published widely on urban development, urban peripheralization, community solutions and informal settlements, and if I might paraphrase, the paradox of urban land regulation given rising levels of informality in urban areas. He's been a visiting researcher at UCLA, and I would emphasize that's UCLA as in Los Angeles, not UCL, which I'll get to in a second, where he has also spent some time. He's been a visiting researcher also at George Washington University and MIT, and I believe in 1997 was at Development Planning Unit, my unit at UCL, with Adriana Allen. And again, this year, I think you were back at UCL with the Institute of Global Prosperity. So I guess I don't need to introduce too much my side of the woods, but it's really a pleasure to have you with us today. And I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on climate resilience and urban planning. It's something that I've been working on in recent times myself, but in a very different part of the world, in the Horn of Africa, particularly the Somali areas, where climate resilience and urban planning are not natural bedmates, in the sense that a lot of climate resistance is built around a very rural-based system of nomadism, pastoralism. I'm very keen to hear your experiences and your thoughts on similar topics, but in the very different sort of context of the cities that you've been working in. Shireen just mentioned, if you do have questions, please do put them in the Q&A or the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on those, and we'll make sure that we answer at all possible as many of them as we can. We've got, I think, 54. I just saw the number of participants on the call at the moment. So it's lovely to have quite a decent group on this call, and hopefully we're going to have a really good discussion afterwards. So let me hand over to Professor Ultramari. Thank you very much for joining us, and please go ahead. I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this really important topic. Thank you, Professor.
So, hello everybody. First of all, I should mention that, well, I'm Clovis Ultramari, but I should mention that I'm not in Curitiba, in Brazil. I'm here, quite close to everybody here. I'm in London for a very special reason. I'm in a sabbatical, the entire in 2023. So I hope I will not disappoint people who were expecting me to present something about the city of Curitiba. I know that among these people who are present in this meeting, I suppose many of you know something about the city, and perhaps were expecting me to say something about the city and the efforts it is now developing towards, let's say, coping with climate change and sustainability. Today, I'm gonna talk about something different. It's much more related with the project I'm developing here in London at the UCL. So thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here at the London International Development Center and to be part of the panel with Professor Michael Walls. The LIDC is still somewhat new to me. Unfortunately, I haven't met its team face to face, but I must say thanks to Professor Claire Hefferman that I think that is behind this invitation, and that it was a conversation with her that provoked me to be present in this event today. And I would like to say thanks to Shireen and many others who certainly helped to organize the meeting today. I know, according to my previous experience, organizing a remote event is sometimes much more difficult to organize a face-to-face event. I'm personally always afraid of something in terms of technology goes wrong. So I get always a little bit nervous about this. So DPU is very familiar to me. I had the opportunity to stay there for a period in the early 2000s. It was a very good time here. And I am also pleased to say that many of my colleagues in Brazil and in Latin America share the same experience at the DPU. So DPU is, Professor Michael, it's a very well-known institution there in Brazil. So thanks to everybody for accepting and Michael to accept to moderate me in this afternoon. My only concern refers to the promise made by the promoters of this event that we would find a solution. They said the outlook can sometimes look bleak, but there are solutions to the challenges we face. Well, I do believe there are solutions. I will do my best, but I'm afraid the topic and the situation does not make things any easier. Let's see what I have to tell you. Well, I understand that the event today aims to bring some ideas about urban resilience and sustainability in more difficult times than those when these concepts were coined, perhaps 50 years ago. At that time, problems seemed not clearly confirmed. Now they are part of our everyday life. And confirmation of climate change is now very, very concrete. After reviewing my presentation for today, I sadly came to the conclusion that this one is perhaps one of my very first pessimistic approach that I have ever made in all my academic life. Yeah. I'm really sorry for this. By the way, the title of my conversation today is, Can Climate Change Make Urban Plans Innovative? Or perhaps, can urban plans be innovative towards climate change? Or may urban plans really help to cope with climate change? So this is a very difficult question because I think it makes clear that there is a doubt in terms of our own subject of research and our professional field. So, I mean, what we are doing as town planners or urban researchers is of any value at all. I know the question is very strong, but I think we should make this question almost every day. So, well, under these circumstances, it's not easy to be optimistic. On the contrary, it would be reasonable to imagine innovative methods or ideas would flourish among those who research urban topics or those who manage our cities. My idea is that despite the fact that the situation is not good, it may be a very unique moment where new ideas can flourish. So you can see, so sometimes I'm a little bit pessimistic, sometimes I'm very pessimistic, but I do believe that in a very terrible situation, new ideas can flourish. My discussion today also focuses on the possible novelties we, again, urban planners and urban researchers, are generating to cope with our contemporary troubles and threats. Short presentation, we try to answer to this or a more specific question. Is climate changing forcing us to accelerate new forms of urban life? Is climate change forcing us to be more creative when we elaborate our urban plans or when we proceed with our research? Are we being very creative or not? Of course, there are no definite or sorry for my English. There are no definite or definitive answers, but we can certainly expect some suggestions. So as scientists, we perfectly know these questions could be answered through different investigative ways, each of them risking presenting different scenarios. Some of them perhaps very controversial. What I mean is that I know that as a scientist, the analysis you make, the parameters you use, the parameters you choose, all these depends on your very personal circumstance and your own very personal approach to your life or to urban life. So a more pessimistic or optimistic personal approach to this investigation certainly influences the format of my rationale, the choice I made for the parameters to use, and undoubtedly the conclusions. These methodological restrictions are well known by all of you, but I just want to make it clear because the discussion today is much more of a first step of subsequent research. So I'm quite clear that what I prepared today is the first step for future research that I'm very interested in doing. So let's go to my methodological steps. Remember, my investigative question: are we urban planners or urban researchers doing something new about climate change and its impact on our cities or not? So the first thing I did was to ask, that's very funny, that's my first time I used ChatGPT and BART for this purpose. So the first thing I did was to ask ChatGPT and BART to provide me a list of 10 cities, or approximately 10 cities, that have elaborated their climate change action plan. I did not mention to ChatGPT nor BART global cities or big cities. I just said, please provide me a list of action plans elaborated by cities. Now, the query I introduced was, of course, replied with a list of well-known international cities, or, I believe, cities with celebrated plans. As you know, ChatGPT collects information generated till 2021. BART seems to be more updated. Even so, the resulting lists are quite similar. Afterward, I confirmed the cities in Google. Again, the list is quite similar. I know sources of the three platforms are similar, of course. The process they use to elaborate the lists are different. So such a coincidence may already suggest a further investigation. So I mean, if I ask a list for ChatGPT, I ask the same list for BART, and again to Google, I have the same list. So of course, all these lists, all these answers from these platforms, they are provided according to the use we have, the people do in the internet. But it means the cities and the plans I got from these platforms are very well-known cities or very well-known plans. So there is something behind this city. It doesn't mean exactly that these cities are the most affected cities by climate change. It means that these cities mean something in the national stage. The final list of the city is New York, Copenhagen, Melbourne, Rotterdam, Cape Town, Singapore, Mexico City, Tokyo, Rio de Janeiro, Durban, in South Africa, Dhaka, Barcelona, and Bogota. So these 13 cities, they repeated themselves in the lists I charged. Of course, it is difficult to say how much this list fully represents the city that are elaborating their action plans to cope with climate change, but it certainly says something. At least these are the most visible plans, not necessarily corresponding to the most visible cities or those that need plans the most. For us, planners and researchers, it may suggest something much more important. From a global perspective, priorities are not given properly. This is my first conclusion. Having the list of the same cities I searched for the plans they elaborate. I mean, I had the list, so I started searching and reading the plans. It was a long work. It was a hard work I did, but I think the results are quite interesting. At least to start a research or to start a debate about what these plans mean. Such plans were all easily available in their full version and in the format of executive summaries. I read the plans with a focus on the concrete actions proposed. In general, those 13 plans are documents with, number one, a clear statement that climate change and its consequences are real threats for the very near future. This scenario somewhat repeats the problems global South cities are used to cope with. So in this diagnosis, everything that is said in these plans, it doesn't matter if it is from a rich or a dual or a poor city, the kind of presenting things is quite similar. So I mean, the problems they present are very, very familiar for people who have been working with planning or urban projects for the last 30 years, let's say minimally. Number two, a long diagnostic, generally focusing on air pollution, scarcity of natural resources, rising temperatures, floods, and landslides. And number three, an action plan listing things to be done. This is somewhat the common structure I found in these 13 plans. The most important thing, they present an agenda, but any of them make no suggestions in terms of law enforcement. Well, I don't know, perhaps according to my experience dealing with urban planning, law enforcement or the legislation resulting from the plan becomes much more important than the plan itself. At least in Brazil, where I have worked, let's say, 80% of my professional life, I would say that a plan means nothing if there is a law behind it. So the first task I proposed myself was to read these plans and make notes, not of their content, but of their approach and of the similarity they present. Needless to say, I was not interested in what this or that city has proposed, but rather on what was said by big picture, and if there is a convergence between them, and if the general scenario suggests innovative ideas or not. My methodology was quite simple. I made a summary of each city or each plan. The summaries constituted my qualitative material for the generalizations I will now present to you. So I will now read my 13 points. I think I still have 10 or 15 minutes to present these points, and then I open for the discussion. So number one, from the list of cities itself, I could immediately say something. 50% is located in the so-called rich countries, and the other 50 may be considered not necessarily very poor, but at least dual cities. The geography confirms that all of them are located on the coast or very near, with only one exception, Mexico City. The threat of increasing sea levels seems to be the very first reason for the elaboration of the plans and suggests an international relevance. So the plan itself is important for local solutions, but there is something behind that's the international agenda that's much more important than one plan itself. Number two, the fact that these plans outstand themselves in the internet community may suggest that they are not just a plan, but rather a plan that generated interest and debate. Unfortunately, it does not mean they will be implemented for sure. So this is, for me, it sounds very, very familiar. I worked with more than 100 urban or metropolitan plans in my entire professional life. And I know that being a planner means to be sometimes very disappointed with the results of the plan. But at the same time, I'm quite sure that every plan I did, every plan I took part was an opportunity to debate, to discuss the city I was working with. So this is the very good side of the plan. So I said, my experience in dealing with urban and metropolitan plans, at least for the last almost 30 years, suggests that changes we are now proposing have their dimension amplified. So there is a difference in terms of dimension of what we had done in the past and what we are doing now. And the plans nowadays are much more complex, depending, for example, on new technologies. That's something that we are not used in plans 10 or 20 years ago. Number three, according to my review, these plans could be simplified as such. I selected what seems to be the most important factor observed by the plan, constituting by their own elaboration. So here comes along a list of the 13 cities, and I prepared some highlights for each of these plans. But I think the highlights are not so important. I will try to summarize it to you. So let's go to my point number 4. By reading all these plans, we may say that the concept of rather the good intention of being climate change responsive repeats the conceptual trajectory of sustainability itself. Well, what I mean is that when he created the concept of sustainability, it was a concept, it was a kind of simple concept. And now the concept of sustainability is something much more complex than it was in the past. So it encompasses a series of a myriad of things and science and approaches and agents that makes this concept very complicated for us to understand. And I believe that with the the climate change actions plans or climate change approach, we are reproducing the same trajectory, the same conceptual trajectory we have experienced with the concept of sustainability. I mean, we started with something simple and we are going to something very, very complex that perhaps the concept is not able to summarize it anymore. Number 5, we can also observe that, and this is what I'm interested the most, the plans repeat what has been very familiar in the plans made since the 1980s or even the 1970s. At least in Brazil, for example, that in the 1970s we had an explosion. Everybody decided to make plans everywhere, and we never thought about the possibilities or the feasibility these plans had, in fact. So I'm afraid that we are reproducing the same thing we had made in the past. Number 6, the majority of the proposals I found in these plans does not exactly intend to reduce climate change, but solely to protect the city. I mean, it means plans are much more focused on adaptation and protection by means, for example, of engineering structures, and not mitigation with the carbon emission reduction. So, I mean, we are finding emergency solutions and we are repeating most of the times some of the engineering solutions that we have already proposed in the past. Mitigation with the carbon emission reduction so becomes a less important action in these plans. It somewhat reminds me the idea of enlarging roads to accommodate increasing flow of private cars to solve traffic congestions. I remember in many countries in Latin America, it was very common to ask for enlargement of the roads just as a solution for the traffic. So I mean, only engineering solutions trying to provide immediate emergency solutions that a problem that, well, everybody knows the result of this and what we have nowadays in the very same cities that adopted these kind of solutions. I come from a city that, well, we believe that we try to do things a little bit different in terms of this subject specifically, trying to avoid this kind of engineering works and giving space to private cars. So number 7, proposals seem to repeat what urban planning and urban management is doing for decades. Again, the same conclusion. Not always or hardly implemented. Perhaps now we will be luckier. In fact, the plans in general embrace a range of initiatives quite similar to those of a comprehensive plan and with no controversial topics or suggestions. What I mean is, when I read these plans, we come to the conclusion that there is no controversies in adopting any of these measures. But in fact, we know that all these measures will be reason for a very, very complicated and long discussions among social agents and among politicians and economic groups, social groups. It will take time for us to have it implemented. But the plans seems to reproduce an idealization that things are quite easy. So what they are proposing may be right, but it's not as simple as that. Number 8, the importance given by the international community to climate change explains the elaboration of such plans in a kind of prolific way, mostly in the big cities, capitals, or global cities. It also explains the desire to show they are doing something. Having a plan or having an action plan for the climate change definitely is the very first step and, for a moment, safeguards the international image the city may have or wants to develop. So it would be unacceptable in a city like Curitiba, where I come from. It's very ironic what I'm saying, but it would be unacceptable for the city of Curitiba not having an action plan. It has. It would be unacceptable for a city like Rio de Janeiro or São Paulo not having such a plan, and they have it. But again, I know these plans very well. I mean now in terms of Brazil. And again, they are reproducing things that we have already said many, many years ago. And I know that it will not be easy to have it implemented. Number 9, I'm almost finished. The elaboration of the plan may so have other intentions than just helping to guarantee our futures or their futures. Action plans, the way they are elaborated and presented, are also one, an opportunity to constitute a showcase, a good practice, a case of success. Number 2, an opportunity to create an expertise that can be sold internationally. This is quite important. Contributing to the global image of the city. Copenhagen, for example, I think that's the best example because they make it very clear in that plan. Among the main objectives, they say a desire to guarantee an outstanding place of this city among those who can export experience. So they say, we are doing this because we must guarantee an expertise. We must tell the world that we have the expertise and we can sell this expertise to everybody. Number 10, in the same perspective, it is quite interesting to think about why cities like Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, Bogota in Colombia, Barcelona, well, Barcelona is Europe in Spain, and Mexico City in Mexico, all large urban areas with their population speaking no English as an official language, but they publish their documents in a bilingual version. That's quite interesting because it may be sound, well, this is just a detail. I don't think so. Because it's very complicated for us in Brazil, for example, to have a plan and to have it translated into a good English. The same thing for a city in Bogota, Colombia, or Mexico, or Argentina. I know they have a plan too, and the summary in English. So it's very complicated. It's very costly. It takes time. It takes money for us. And but what is the reason behind it? So cities in my list are global, I recognize, but these plans are to be negotiated solely among local agents and with the regional and central governments who speak either Portuguese or Spanish in the cases I selected. So I am convinced there is also an intention to suggest themselves as international leaders of ideas. Again, according to the plan review and the plans in Brazil, that's a very interesting conclusion because after checking the plans in my list of 13 cities I prepared to you, I went to look for some plans in Brazil, and I found the same situation. They all have a part or the full document in English. Please do not take my observation as a proposal to decolonize. I like this topic, but this is not the case now. Okay, it is rather an intriguing observation. If those plans are to be locally implemented, the primate reader or user is someone who lives in the cities. Number 11, plans I analyzed are very much based on engineering and infrastructure projects. Again, it's much more an adaptive plan than a mitigation one. So, and you know, all this is very familiar for the cities in the south that are still struggling for better conditions of living. So things we are proposing in these action plans for the cities in the south, they are, first of all, they are trying to give an answer to the social problems we still have: lack of houses, lack of green areas, lack of public transportation, problems with air pollution. So all these we need to fight it. It doesn't matter if it is a local plan or if it is a plan for it's an action plan for climate change. Perhaps I can skip number 12. Let's see, because I'm worried about the time. Yes, I will skip it. Yes. Just one point that is quite important to me. We cannot take these plans as something that can, the proposals that we find in these plans, we cannot take it very easily, of course. And one of the reasons that cannot be taken easily is because these plans are made by local governments, by people in their own cities, but we very much depend on federal decisions, on regional decisions, on federal money, for example, or on national legislation, as in the case of Brazil. Just to give you one example, in Brazil, what is going on there today, that at the same time you have a proliferation of climate change action plans made by different cities, not only the big cities, but also the medium-sized cities. At the same time, you have this huge effort. We have a new program proposed by the federal new government, and we are giving a discount. That's quite interesting. We are giving a discount for people, for poor people buying what we call a popular car. So we can get a discount of 5 or even 10% of the final price of your car, at a moment that what we really need is some very alternative ways of transportation, and not, say, providing people popular cars. Well, I know that the idea behind the national government is very social, and it is quite interesting too. And there is an idea of boosting the economy, and it's already producing some results. I'm very happy about this. But if you take this action and we put it side by side with the proposals made by local plans, there is something wrong. And I think it confirms my idea that, well, things are not so easy. Everything is right, but it's not as easy as plans may suggest. Well, now we have 13 cities or 13 plans, and my 13 comments. That was just a coincidence. How could I sum it up and leave a final message to you? Global scenario may be critical. Urban plans to cope with it may not be really innovative, but they are still absolutely necessary. They are at least an opportunity to discuss our cities, to make things clearer. From the scientific or academic perspective, these plans, they suggest the existence of an investigative void. How are they made? How could we make more effective? And how can we learn from history? This is a very important question for us to analyze from a scientific perspective. This is my presentation. Something I did for today, but I understand it deserves further investigation. Very honestly, I prepared this only for this afternoon, but I'm very interested in going further in this discussion. So I think if you have any questions, I think it would be, let's say, my very first steps to get along with this maybe new research for me and perhaps a new article. So thank you very much for your patience, and sorry for my English.
Thank you very much, Professor Ultramari. Very interesting. I'm not, you started off by commenting on how it was very hard to be optimistic, but you suggested that one of the optimistic points might be that this is a moment when there's a chance for new ideas to flourish. And I wonder if people might be interested in pursuing that in some of the questions. Can I ask anyone that does want to ask any questions? There's a Q&A function on your Zoom on the webinar. If you click on that, you should be able to add a question to that. And we will then answer each of those questions as we come. There are quite a lot of people with us, so it would be a fantastic opportunity to generate some discussion, I think, around what Professor Ultramari has just been saying. So I do encourage you to add your questions in the Q&A. Maybe while we're waiting for people to add questions, I could ask you your thoughts on your presentation. Your findings essentially are rather pessimistic, in the sense that I agree with you that one of the hopes, one of the optimistic hopes with thinking about urban planning to address climate change, and I mean to address in its broadest sense, which could be mitigation, it could be adaptation, it could be coping with the loss and damage aspect of climate change, but that surely the urgency of that should be driving creativity. Why is it that we're not finding more creativity in urban plans in that space? It seems really such an awful situation if we're not. Perhaps if you could comment on that. We've got a couple of people posting comments, so I'll read those out in just a second, but perhaps if we could start with that one.
Okay. So Michael, this is very complicated for me to answer. I would love to answer you in Portuguese. I would feel much more confident. But anyway, I will try it. Well, this is the very first time I make a presentation with a pessimistic approach, and this is the first time I really read these plans. So I think I've been very frank in being pessimistic, but perhaps I will give a second thought. I will think twice or 3 or 4 times again, and let's see how pessimist I'm really am. So, well, but you asked me about why there is not so much innovative approaches in our plans. Well, I have already thought about this, but I would say that the main reason is that plans, at least the plans I worked with, and they are, as I said, perhaps 80% of them are in Brazil. I would say that they are too much regulated. The way we do plans nowadays must be exactly the same. For example, if I work in a city quite in the south of Brazil that presents a reality completely different from the north of Brazil, is 5,000 kilometers. It's quite the same. Methodology is the same. The process of discussing with the community is the same. The way you present it to the local government and the way local government discuss it are very much the same. To give you a very concrete example, we are now involved in the metropolitan region of Curitiba plan. It's a plan for 3.5 million inhabitants, and we are responsible for this plan. And we just proposed a different way of doing things. I'm not saying that I was very innovative. Perhaps I was not innovative at all, but I just proposed to do something different in terms of thinking about the problems, giving priority to certain things, forgetting certain things. But when we presented to the institution, they said, well, it's okay, it's quite interesting, but we cannot accept it because it is against the law. we must stick to the law, to the institutional law, to the, not exactly law, but we have rules to follow. It's a kind of a ritual. We must follow, we must do the plan, the same thing as we are expecting you to do. So there is no room for novelty in this case. So, very, very precisely, I would say that there are relations behind it that block our. And another thing, and this is very, very controversial, because I would love to say to explain it in Portuguese, because it's very complicated. But you know that public participation, it's very paradoxical, but sometimes it blocks the innovative solutions. You know why? Because when you go to a poor city, you are in a poor city, and you go there to discuss new things. The most important thing is water, sewage system, transport. Well, those that are very well known problems in this city. But there is something new, and this is quite important. In Portuguese and Spanish, we call it urban insurgencies. I know that in English it has a different meaning, urban insurgencies. I know that in English you use it for military action, but in Portuguese and in Spanish we use it in a different context. It means solutions brought by the community themselves. And these, I can tell you, they are fantastic. If you go to the very deep poor areas in São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro and big cities in Brazil, you find wonderful solutions, really wonderful solutions that are totally ignoring planners and ignoring government. They are finding solutions on their own way. This is fantastic.
So that connects with your work on.
I'm not as pessimistic as I may look.
Yeah, in fact, that answer connects with your work on community-based action in informal settings, and maybe that's something we can come back to. We actually have quite a few questions now, so I'll try and cluster a couple as I go so that we can get through more. We have one which I'm not going to ask now from someone in Curitiba who has a question, but I will get to that in a second. But first, two short ones. One is from someone who's anonymous, so I can't tell you who it is. Two of these are anonymous. Can we address sustainable urban environments while not addressing the root cause of homelessness? So very specific, that one. And if I could couple that with another one, which is, what are the most effective forms of low-cost climate adaptations at a local level? Two short questions. Could you address each of those two briefly? So the first one on homelessness, can we address sustainability in urban environments without addressing homelessness?
No, I think it's impossible. Look, and my answer is not based on a scientific perspective. My answer is based on I would say, a more sociological perspective, because when you have a plan, when you have let's say, it doesn't matter if it's an action plan for climate change, or a master plan, or a development plan, or a strategic plan, you always have different actors, different social actors fighting for something. So you be obliged to accept. So according to a social perspective, you have to discuss this. So this is what I said. Things are not as easy as they are idealized in the plan. So we must accept that we have to discuss it with different people, different social agents, and sometimes they will not accept it. For example, I know many times I have worked in areas that I have to discuss. Well, this is very important in terms of environmental. It is environmentally important, but at the same time, poor people are trying to use this land for housing purposes. So how to combine it? I have no solution for this. It depends on case by case. Yeah, that's very deep.
Okay, but you answered the question. You're saying you need to address that in order to address sustainability
I'm quite
broadly.
sure.
So, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. No.
Can you talk a little bit about?
Sorry.
Yeah. No problem. Can you talk a little bit about the most effective forms of low-cost climate adaptations at a local level that you've come across?
Well, we have found some low-cost solutions, but and I'm very excited about this. For example, when I work with local solutions, what I said, urban insurgencies, let's say, solutions coming from the poor communities. I'm very, very excited about these kind of solutions, but I'm not so sure that we can rely, perhaps I would say, I'm sure, we cannot rely solely on these solutions. There will be a time that we will need a lot of money to bring real solutions. For example, how can you cope with the public transportation problems in São Paulo or Rio de Janeiro with low-cost solutions? Well, of course, it depends on what you call for local low-cost solutions. But anyway, if you think about a solution for transport in a city like Rio de Janeiro or even London, let's take a poor city. Let's talk about Rio de Janeiro or São Paulo or Bogota. I would say that I don't think only low-cost solutions will solve the problem. I think it's very, very difficult, unfortunately.
Okay. Can you give any examples of low-cost solutions that you think have been,
well,
even
yes,
if not enough effective?
Okay. Well, it is still under discussion, but let's take the case of Curitiba. I don't know if people here have heard about this city, but let's say back in the 1990s, this city in the south of Brazil, with 2 million inhabitants, it became very famous for the solutions it found for the public transportation system we adopted in the system. That was wonderful for the city, and it was so far considered a low-cost solution because we could not afford a subway system. Of course, a subway system would be much more comfortable for everybody in the city, but we decided that no, let's take a low cost, and it was in fact a low cost, not very, very low cost solutions, but comparing to the subway system is much more cheaper. And but now it is still under discussion, but there is a limit for this. Now we are start seeing people, and myself, we are starting bring this subject again. Perhaps now it's time for us to discuss the subway system again. So it's not low cost solution anymore, but at that time it was possible. Well, another example that I could bring from my city is that at that time, and it is still valid today, we try to avoid floods by segregating, by defining green areas that are very important for the drainage system. It costed almost nothing for the municipality, and the result was fantastic. So we eliminated the hundreds of hectares from flooding just by protecting certain areas. At that time, the most important thing was not park, but now it became a park. But at that time, these areas were, let's say, protected only for the very purpose of for the drainage system. And it worked very well. And it was an example of a very, very low cost proposal that worked.
Thank you for that. And I wonder if we could just stay with Curitiba for a moment. We have Ariadne, and it's lovely to see Ariadne on the call. She's, I remember from DPU some years ago, so it's lovely to have someone both from Curitiba and from DPU. Ariadne is asking, did you find in the plans that you looked at any prescribed examples of what she's calling urban acupunctures, in the sense of helping society to have a more concrete idea of the overall objectives of the plan? We've got quite a few questions, so if you could answer briefly, that would be fantastic. But yeah. more concrete ideas
maybe.
for? Yeah.
Maybe. Well, of course, it's the concept of urban cultures may be a little bit tricky, or any concept is a little bit tricky for us. But I think we can find some urban cultures in those plans. For example, when they are very precise, defining, for example, an area for a park. So this is I call it an urban acupuncture. So perhaps this is a very precise solution, very acupunctural solution that, well, we are all convinced that you help us in, let's say, avoiding floods, help us with the rising temperatures. Of course, I think it's yeah, I think we can find it mainly in the preservation of green areas. I think we can find it. Again, low cost and urban acupunctures.
Great. Okay. I want to change geographic region completely. I mentioned before that I've done quite a lot of work on working in the Horn of Africa, the Somali Horn of Africa. And we have a question from Dr. Jama Musa Jama from Hargeisa in Somaliland. He's asking, the climate's changed. We need to accept that. There's no point, no room for pessimism. We need to accept the reality and somehow deal with it. His question is, if we do think, therefore, positively because we have no choice, what could be the positive ways of addressing climate change, and particularly in an African context? If you have any reflection on that.
Well, I don't know. What's the name of the person again, Michael?
Jama Musa Jama.
Jama. I'm not quite sure that I can put Africa and Latin America together, but well, but anyway, both parts of the world are still fighting against social problems in a let's say in a desperate way. Of course, perhaps scales may be a little bit different, but we still need to fight for these improvements, for these social improvements. There is no other way, and these will make things much more complicated. You see, it may be things. Now I'm going to give you a little bit more optimistic approach. Yes, I think I found one, and maybe I can answer it to Africa. When we are, let's say, on the verge of a disaster, the situation is terrible, but at the same time, it speeds up the adoption of solutions. I had this experience very in a very concrete way, again in Curitiba and in Brazil. For example, we fought for some housing solutions in a very poor area in a certain metropolitan region in Brazil, and it was very difficult to find money for these. And back in early 2000, we had very heavy rains. And after this, of course, the impact was terrible, really terrible. But at the same time, this disaster, or being afraid of further disaster or more disastrous situation, it certainly speeded up money and political decision to change things. So I'm not proposing to wait for the worst to have the solution, but I think that every time we talk about the problems we are facing, every time we are talking about the problems we are facing in the future, or the problems in the future are showing us, I think that's already something that maybe help us in things that we planners and researchers are saying for years and years. So yes, behind this situation, maybe we can find some political decision or economic decision to change things.
Okay, thank you. I've got two questions relating to the UK. So maybe if we take those two, one is from, in fact, coming from Anthony Vellian, who's in New Zealand. He has two questions, one about New Zealand, one about the UK. So let's take the two about UK. The other one is from someone anonymous, so can't give you the name. So Anthony's question about the UK is from 2002 to 6, UK local government were required to monitor economic, social, and environmental indicators as part of their work towards sustainable development. He's asking, he just says he doesn't know if they did action plans, but they don't seem to now. Do you know of moves to restart action plans or monitoring activity along the lines that were happening in the UK in those years in relation to climate change and the SDGs, the more contemporary context? And the second one, which I'll get to I'll remind you of in a second, but I'll read it now, is recently Oxford saw protests against the 15-minute city plan when implementing climate resilient urban plans. How can we soften the blow of big changes and convey positive impacts to residents? I would add to that, recently there was a very famous by-election loss for Labour in the electorate of Uxbridge, which was blamed on the introduction of ultra-low emissions zone, where, like the Oxford protests against the low traffic neighborhoods, the 15-minute city and so on, was also seen as a pushback against climate change positive plans. So the question, I think, is consistent across both those instances. How can we soften the blows of big changes and convey a positive impact to residents in a way that makes it palatable, so we don't end up with voters penalizing politicians that espouse climate change plans? So maybe first the one about UK local government from 2002 to 6 and the way monitoring was used and whether there are plans to use that in the future, and then we get to the making it palatable for electorates.
Okay, well, I'm not familiarized with the two examples you bring, but I think that the idea is how to cope with situations that will not accept changes that are needed to cope with climate change. Is it right? I mean,
yes, and I think you can transfer it to a Brazilian context very easily, because I think the same pushback is driven by similar concerns.
Yeah. Well, I think this is the next step, because now we have the plans and now we are going to fight for implementing them. The only difference is that when you had the old plans that we are used to do, like for example, the master plan, we professional used to propose the plan was approved, and sometimes it was adopted or not adopted. And but now I think that we need a second step to where we are still responsible for the implementation of the plan, because everybody is worried about this situation. So, but I return to the example I brought about Brazil, that at the same time we have plans being elaborated, and it's very it costs a lot of money, a lot of time for us and everybody, and a lot of hopes also. And at the same time we have the government that is absolutely driven by environmental and social concerns. It's quite clear. At the same time is this government, the national government, presents itself as a government that is concerned with environmental and social problems. At the same time, he presents himself as such. We have a program that is fostering that is proposing us to buy more and more cars. So far, two things are very well. They can go well, no problem. But at the moment I put both things together and I propose a discussion, there will be controversy. I'm quite sure. So the same thing that happened here will happen there, and it will happen in any other plan. So controversy is the next step of any plan that we have so far developed. And this is something that I don't know as a planner what we could do. Perhaps that's not our, perhaps the idea must come from outside. Perhaps the idea may come from the society itself. We must convince the society that the future is not good if you don't stick to these plans. Perhaps this is the only thing that we could do. Let's say take the second step and think about how to convince society that these plans are absolutely important.
Okay,
So
thank
you
you.
see, I cannot bring you a very precise question for this because these things are still under discussion. We are still learning how to do this. These plans are not the same as the old. They may repeat the same content, but the context is absolutely different.
Mm. Yeah, and I'm not sure that it's possible to give a simple answer to that. It's a huge question. But what about the issue that Anthony was raising about whether you're aware of any plans to restart action plans or monitoring along the lines of what has existed perhaps in the early 2000s or even in the 1990s around monitoring for economic, social, and environmental indicators around the sustainable development paradigm, but in the context of the current time. Are you aware of? You mentioned that a lot of plans repeat those kind of earlier approaches. Are you aware of any that are really trying to restart that action and monitoring activity?
Well, we are proposing monitoring plans since the 1990s, I think. So we have plenty of indicators. In Brazil, it's a proliferation, and I think Brazil is not an exception. Everywhere in the world, we have a proliferation of parameters and indicators to monitor, to evaluate the situation. Now we have much more information than we had in the past. It's quite much easier for us to monitor any situation or to monitor the implementation of any plan. And we already know that most of these plans or any other plans, they were not fully implemented. So I think, well, we should go on doing this, of course. Well, we need to monitor, at least to check if it is possible or not, if it is right or not, but mostly if our governments are adopting it or not. But I think the most important thing that, and this is something that's quite clear in the plans I read, there is a void in terms of law, of making them not only plans but transforming them into new legislations. So, for example, we have a deadline for reducing certain parameters in the air pollution or in the use of fossil fuel cars, like you have here in Britain. I think it's 2030, I suppose. So we have it, but at the same time, we need, at least in my country, what we need is we have a legislation to enforce it, to oblige people and the economic and political sector to adopt it and say, well, this deadline must be accepted, must be adopted. This is what we really need. So we know how to monitor, we know about the context, we know about the situation. We agree about the problems we're facing and the problems we will face in the future, but now we need some very strong legislation, number one, and number two, perhaps, is to make it even more and more clear among society that situation is not good.
Okay, great.
And we are.
Thanks, Clovis. I'm keen to push on because we're out of time, but we have a couple more questions here. So maybe if people that are on the call and yourself are willing to sort of allow us a few minutes latitude, we can get through just another 2 rounds of questions. So one is, I mentioned before, Anthony had asked from New Zealand. He mentions that some politicians from the North Shore of Auckland visited Curitiba in 2006 and were very impressed. He's asking, he particularly mentions the floodplains, which I think you were talking about before, which was reserved for parks now, not housing. He's asking, has Curitiba been impacted negatively by the Bolsonaro years, as has happened in the Amazon and some other areas? Or has it been able to keep its room for positive action?
So I understand there are two questions. Yes, one is about the flooding areas, and the other one is about possible impact.
He's not asking about the flooding areas. He's just mentioning that was one of the things that impressed them. So the question is about how much have those initiatives been impacted by the years with the Bolsonaro government in power?
Okay. Well, how can I say? Those were terrible years for us. Not for everybody. Perhaps for 50% of the country, they were happy about this. They believed in something. But I think that those were terrible years for us. And well, in terms of impact in Curitiba had, during the Bolsonaro years, 4 years, Curitiba had the same, not exactly the same people, but the same political group, or perhaps better, the same technical group that was behind the different political groups. I mean, so the same technical group, the same, and sometimes the same people who worked in the municipality back in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000, they are still there. So either the same people or people who were, let's say, they were educated in the same ideas. So Curitiba had the opportunity and the chance, the unique opportunity to repeat things and to maintain the certain ideas. Of course, the economic situation of the country, much more than the Bolsonaro's attitudes, influenced negatively. But this was a general situation. Again, Curitiba is in the south of the country. South of Brazil has a better situation, generally speaking. Of course, the income is a little bit higher. We have problems, of course, but in general terms, situation there is much better than the rest of the country. Not only the south, but Curitiba specifically. So it made things easier. So answer the question. I would say that the permanence, I don't know if this word is right in English, but the permanence of the same people, or the same ideas, with certain changes, but let's say there has been no violent change in the political group, it helped the city to maintain the same ideas along all these years.
Okay,
thank you. This is good, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, good in spite of some of the bad, I guess.
Yeah.
So, so let's finish with one last. There are a couple of questions. I'm really sorry. There are some questions that we're just not going to get the chance to answer. But I wanted to finish. There are a few questions around elements of inequality and diversity, which I think is a good place to end. It's a big question. So Yashika Kapoor and Deborah Ciciola both ask similar questions in terms of diversity and inclusion. So Deborah's comment is that celebrating diversity and inclusion seems to take a backseat in the context of climate change. Is it possible to see it as a socio-environmental issue rather than just an environmental one? And Yoshika asks, in relation to Delhi, where she's from, she comments that everyone everywhere is a potential victim of climate catastrophe, yet the poor are the most affected. Why are the wealthy not held accountable for this? Delhi is known for its poor air quality. The rich can afford air purifiers, but the poor can't, as an example of this inequality very specifically. Can you perhaps comment on that issue of inequality or social concerns and the way that they seem to often be excluded or even to clash with efforts to try and address climate change? And we'll end on that point. And Shireen's going to say a few words at the end. So, but that's the last question.
Okay. So this is very, very difficult for me to answer. But I would say, I hope that climate change, or let's say the risk of climate change, the risk and the impacts climate change is bringing, I think and I hope it will bring some new light for the discussion in terms of poverty and diversity we have in our cities. I would say that we have the urban insurgencies we have in many countries. Not only I'm working in urban insurgency in Latin America, so I can say something about other cities too. That's quite similar to what I've seen in Brazil. You know, if you go to these cities, it's quite clear now that we need to change this reality. We cannot afford it anymore, these poverty-driven cities. So this is one thing. And at the same time, we are discussing poverty. We are discussing diversity too. So people in these cities, they are so strong discussing about the urgent need to reduce poverty, and at the same time to discuss or to bring diversity. This is something absolutely great, I think. Someone I think mentioned the word celebration, or I think it was someone from Curitiba. She used the word celebration. I think this is something that we can, at the same time we are facing such terrible problems, we also have this celebration of the cities. So people are still celebrating the cities. And celebration is not just party. Celebration is also asking for poverty reduction and adoption of diversity questions in our plans. I think this is absolutely important. Yeah, this is very, very difficult for me to answer this question, because it's, of course, it's we are saying the same thing for the last 2 or 3 decades. We must face the problem of poverty. This is the main problem. If you take the plans I read, if you take the plans, for example, Rio de Janeiro, there is quite easy. We are still saying the same thing. For example, we need, before anything else, we need to discuss public participation, and we need to reduce poverty, and we need to discuss diversity. So you see how things are evident, are clear to us now, that all these subjects are returning, and perhaps now it will be taken more seriously.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Professor Ultramari. Really appreciate your talk and your comments. I'm sorry we ran a little bit over time, but that's definitely all we have time for now. But before we close, I know Shireen wants to say a few words. So just from me, thank you very much, Professor Ultramari. Very interesting discussion. Really appreciate your time.
If I don't have the opportunity to return, I just say goodbye to everybody. And it was a huge opportunity for me to start this discussion. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And of course, I'm going to thank you both for really keeping such a wide issue, for enlightening us as to the nuances of such a wide issue that does affect us all. There's nobody who isn't affected by urban planning and climate change. Professor Walls, I hope that I haven't frozen again. I think
You're fine.
Yeah, I know that you are, very, very busy. I know that you've interrupted your sojourn to come and do this for us. I'm very grateful. Professor Ultramari, wonderful. Thank you so much. How lucky were we that you actually happened to be in the country at the time that we're planning this event. Very grateful for everybody who's joined us today. Just a reminder, I mean, you mentioned decolonization. I relate everything to decolonization and colonialism and imperialism and all those other isms. We will be having more events on that. We are coming to a freshers event at a university near you if you are in London. If you have any ideas for things that you would like to see LIDC work on, let us know. We do a range of events from networking to webinars, seminars, all kinds of things. And I want to make a particular mention here of the fact that we are now taking applications for our short course in evaluation. The title's very long this year, but it's evaluation, global health and development, that sort of thing. And yes, I realize it's been a long afternoon. Thank you everyone for joining us. Do link up with us on X, as it's now known, and all our other social media platforms. And we will post the recording of this as soon as we are able to. So for now, thank you for your time. Thank you for the elucidation. Thank you for the intelligence, and thank you for the conversation, everybody. Take care and have a good rest of your weeks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Shireen. Thanks both. Bye.